Okay, folks, we are live on Facebook. And I'm going to jump back here to Zoom. And here we are with Dr. Carrie Jeunesse. I am so excited about our talk tonight. Carrie is a really, really dear friend of quite a number of years. We have had hours and hours of conversation. And normally I will give a little introduction. Now, I put a bio on our Facebook page because I won't give an introduction tonight because it would probably take the entire half an hour to run through all of the wonderful things you've done. So we'll just say that this is Dr. Carrie Jeunesse, international consultant, veterinarian, really a true hero for the world. Thank you very much for being on Life with Bob with me.
Oh, my pleasure. This will be fun.
Absolutely. So I understand you have some slides for us.
I do.
And you can kind of pop them up and run through them, and then we can have a discussion.
Okay, that sounds great. Hopefully that'll prime the pump for people about what they might be interested in discussing a little bit more.
Okay.
All right, let me share and load my presentation here. So the reason it would have taken you a half hour is because I think I have professional ADD. So this slide kind of helped me organize my thoughts for a presentation I had to do several years ago. So I think my bio explained it, but for those who didn't have the time or didn't care to read it, my background is in parallel in organizational leadership and development, and then primarily in veterinary medicine, but let's just say the biomedical, social, and behavioral sciences. So this is my reminder of the things that I care about and that I do in the world. And one of my favorite animals that I've worked on has been elephants. So I just chose elephant to make my little word crowd. So as we talk, we're going to touch on almost all of this stuff. So once I give you the slides, if people want to refer back to that to frame it, they can do that. So in thinking about what I care about and what I want to do, I think primarily because I started out my professional career with a focus on being a doctor, of course, my goal was to reduce suffering and improve well-being. And then as I went through life and was graduating veterinary school about the time the HIV/AIDS epidemic was going on and seeing what was happening with policy and in disenfranchised communities or communities that didn't have the resources and what that was doing to those communities, but also the vulnerability that gave the entire world. I'm sure folks of my generation remember the fear around HIV/AIDS, especially before we knew how it was transmitted. That there became another piece of that I thought, you know, if this is going to matter, how do we look at things a little bit more holistically? So when I worked I was a American Association for the Advancement of Science, Congressional Science and Technology Policy Advisor for in the US Congress, and worked for the senior congressman from Nebraska, Mr. Jeff Fortenberry, who was a fabulous, fabulous person to work with. I won't go into the detail, but we had a lot of really important parallel background about things that we cared about and things that we were doing in the world. So it was a really good fit for me in his office. And I loved how he framed things. You know, and I do this when I do organizational leadership, try to have people frame things in terms of what their mission and their visions are. And he was very strategic in focusing on national economic and family security. So anything we did had to be framed in terms of those things. And ideally, everything we did had to touch on aspects of all of those things. So when he had me working on wildlife conservation, anti-poaching, anti-trafficking, transnational crime, food security, animal welfare, agriculture, international development, poverty alleviation, was all contained in that. And interestingly, he was loved by the Obama administration because Mr. Fortenberry was one of the original co-sponsors of the Global Food Security Act, or Feed the Future. So for those that are interested in one of the flagship and ongoing flagship aid programs that gets, you know, billions of dollars, that would be one to look at. So he was a huge...
Just to put a point on it,
yeah.
Fortenberry was a Republican, and as you mentioned to me, because of the complexion of the Congress, you have in your career worked primarily with Republican representatives.
Right. So I was one of the few fellows that worked in a Republican office, and that was just kind of by happenstance. There's a longer story there that's not that relevant, but I looked at what he cared about and what he was working on, and that's what meant. and so at that time, I was kind of naive when I went into Congress. He was a member of the state, the Appropriations Committee, but the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, which is a very, very powerful committee for international aid. And so he hadn't done a lot with global health, but when Ebola came along and I was able to explain to him why Ebola was such a problem for the kinds of things that he was already working on and cared about, then he turned me loose, and our office was one of the leaders in some of the policy that was being developed and the education for staffers and for partners that was being developed around food security, health system strengthening, all that sort of thing. So all of these things come into play: biosafety, public health, strengthening health systems. And so these are a few of the things I've done, what they call all hazards disaster preparedness planning and response. I'll talk more about that. And then the goal of increasing security and safety, because we know if we have things like transnational crime, problems with biosecurity and bioterrorism, that our communities are more vulnerable. And certainly, as somebody that has their foundations in agriculture as a veterinarian, our economies are significantly at risk, as well as then, our community stability, because if our ag fails, our economies fail, at-risk communities are damaged. So the goal is, and we're part of the globe, right? It's not just the US and global. The US is part of that global conversation. And so I keep things pretty simple: policy, partnerships, and programs. So everything we touch on is going to be framed around the work that I've done in those areas and the work that I've supported other people in doing in those areas. And to keep me focused, if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else. So I do listen to Yogi Berra and have that up as a reminder to myself. I usually know where I'm going. Sometimes I just don't quite know how I'm going to get there. So that idea of being open to possibilities, it's been a pretty exciting ride. So I just want to let people know, so I've worked from the ground in the US and vulnerable communities. Oh, sorry about that. Don't know what that was about. So on the ground in crisis affected communities, I do both pure disaster response kind of stuff, and then I also do disaster mental health and they call secondary traumatic stress work with first responders and people that are working on the scene in disasters to support them with their own well-being, because of course they're very stressed by that work. This was the Oso-Darrington landslide in Washington State in early 2014. And it's hard to get the perspective. This is across a very large valley floor. This is a cubic mile of mud that slid down and wiped out an entire community. And so I was there, I was called in by an organization to do disaster mental health in the schools, but then a little bit later, FEMA to set up some of their, as part of their medical working group, to set up the veterinary services for the search and rescue dogs. So I'll talk more about that later. So, but these are the kind of things, this is Liberia in 2013. These are the types of things that make global security problematic and make our heartstrings get kind of tugged at as well. So you can see how tiny these kids are. This is in one of the poorer communities. It's called Rock Hill in Liberia. And so here's this little tiny guy lugging this huge, I think that's like a 5-gallon water container. These children are doing labor all the time. They're just so poor. A lot of them are orphaned. They're street kids. This pile of rock, I'll show you in another picture. So look at the size of that pile of rock, and then look at that rock. So this rock started out as that rock. And if you look at this little boy, he's got in his right hand a chisel, and you can't see it, it's behind the weeds, but he's got a hammer. So these kids are out there, and sometimes women, but a lot of times children are out there all day long, chipping away at this rock, and they have to make this gravel a certain size, and then trucks come along and haul it away. So no eye protection, no labor standards. They work for pennies. And so this is not a quality of life I think that any of us want to have for any child in the world. So I mean, I love the work I do. I don't know that I'm going to fix that problem, but it's important. From a public health standpoint, this is one of the first communities that we worked in when we were doing public health capacity building training. I was there with Veterinarians Without Borders training. We were doing a rabies campaign, but part of that was to build trust with the communities so that when there was a public health crisis, they would already understand what it looked like to have people come in and do that. And we're seeing this now, that problem of communications with the communities with the Ebola epidemic that's happening in DRC, in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo now, that is now, we've got cases spread to Uganda. So that's going on a year, not under control. Same problems with trust, listening to communities, social engagement, local relevance, and culture are the factors that are confounding those efforts. And Ebola is a bad disease, and it poses a risk for the entire world. So, but these are the conditions, and you can, I mean, as a veterinarian who does public health, to see that water there and know how many infectious diseases are probably swimming around in there and how vulnerable these kids are, and anybody who lives there, it's really compelling for doing this kind of work. This is rainy season in Liberia, and when we needed, we didn't take everything we needed with us, so we would need some supplies, some towels or something, but this is a typical roadside market in Liberia in the rainy season. This is where most people go to shop. There's a few, quote, supermarkets that are in Monrovia, the capital, but this is in Monrovia. This is where people go to buy and sell goods. I was bitten by a dog when I was there who was probably rabid. That's a longer story, but this is a clinic I went to. So you can see the clinics are quite spare. The medical care was quite good. The nurse I saw was quite knowledgeable, but this is not sufficient if you're trying to control some sort of a major disease outbreak, or if somebody's having a major health problem, road vehicle accident, something like that. So part of our health system strengthening is looking at what we do to strengthen these local medical facilities. So part of what I do is teaching and training and helping people. So this concept of interdisciplinary approaches and resilient systems, integrated approaches to development, are pretty new. And our organization, Veterinarians Without Borders, was one of the first that was asked to help Department of Defense kind of figure out how do we do resilience, capacity building, value chain development, because classically on their humanitarian assistance and disaster response missions, they're going in and they're dropping off medical services. They're doing, eye exams and giving hearing aids and doing surgeries. Well, that doesn't really build capacity. And if capacity does exist there, if there are doctors there doing that, or clinics there providing some kind of care, and you come in and do those services, you can actually put those people out of business. And then when your ship moves on to the next port, they have no capacity whatsoever left. So you're causing more harm than good. So when I was working as program manager, then I was asked to help them understand how do we start doing this. And they're working towards that. It's a big ship, but the Department of Defense really gets it. They're one of my favorite organizations to work with, and they're working really hard to do this. This is the class of fellows that I was in, and it doesn't matter where I am, but this is how many PhD, MD, there's one attorney in the group, and veterinarians were in DC that year as fellows. So 275 were in executive branch, and I think there were 33 of us in congressional branch. But these are scientists who go to help inform policy that's based on thoughtful understanding of science. So it's a very, very objective. We're not slanting it with opinion, right? We're scientists. So that was a wonderful experience. And so kind of all over the map with things, but so I just want to give you a perspective of the types of creatures I've worked with and how that informs what we're looking at. So everything from like flying foxes and little squirrels up to elephants. I worked with whales. But when you study that, you start understanding the intricacies of how we're all woven into the environments in which we live and what it takes to sustain this biodiversity and all these creatures, and why that biodiversity is so important. So why issues like deforestation and loss of pinnacle predators and wiping out of large swaths of, say, the prairie in the Midwest, why that's so critical for maintaining the balance we have to support life as we know it. We depend on all of these other creatures to do that. So this again is Liberia. When I was there, I was asked, ironically, I was asked to, now this is 2013, Ebola started early 2014. So I was asked, by the way, while you're here, can you train a group of people who are able to respond if we have a public health crisis? So we used a rabies vaccine for dogs as a model. And I love this because our model is always train the trainer. So on the lower left there, you'll see Hannah is standing behind Helena. And Hannah was interested in pharmacy. So when we were doing it, she said, I want to learn about vaccine handling and how to load the syringes and how to keep the vaccine cold. There's no cold chain there. There's no electrical chain, so we can keep refrigerators going. So we have to carry ice chests and ice packs and make sure we have capacity. There's a couple of hospitals. You go to the hospital and say, can we keep our vaccine here? Because the electricity goes out for sometimes 12 to 18 hours at a time. So it's so much more complicated than it is here. But those countries with that lack of capacity are sometimes the weak link very often in our global health security. And there's a bunch of references on that I'm happy to share with people. So the second day we're out, I turn around after one day of working with training Hannah, and I see her training Helena. This was like the most amazing thing to see, and they learn so quickly, and they're so bright and so knowledgeable about their local environment, and they're so motivated because they see what rabies does in their communities. People die there. So this was great to see. And then the upper right, I think that's Augustine. I can't remember the young lady's name, but so what we did is we figured out, who was good at paperwork, who was good at communicating with the people that came in, who was good at handling vaccine, who was good at giving the vaccines, and we ended up with this list of people and categorized by their expertise. And so I sent that as a spreadsheet in our grant report to U.S. Agency for International Development. And they had already been prior trained in biosecurity with the hazmat suits and personal protective gear and all that. So Ebola comes around. Guess how many of them were engaged, employed, called up to work on Ebola? None. Really interesting policies that the US government won't pay for foreign nationals. They got real weird funding stuff. So part of our policy is looking at, okay, you asked us to train them. We did. Now, why can't we utilize them? They have the most cultural knowledge and community knowledge and relationships already built. Ebola would have gone much better had we, I think, in these communities at least, had we be able to engage people that were already there. And I'll talk a little bit more later about, I'll show you a picture of the guy that I think should be credited with ending the Ebola epidemic, at least in Liberia. So from the field at disaster sites and getting all sweaty in West Africa and other places to Congress. So this is, on the left is Congressman Fortenberry. And this is my blue star for doing a great US Ebola congressional forum. That was quite a historic event. And Bob, I've given you a link for that on YouTube. If people really want to get into the meat of that, it's 4 or 5 hours long, which is very unusual for Congress. But there's several experts on that panel, some ambassadors and other folks that are high up in health security. And then I got to meet President Obama towards the end of his administration. Upper right is the now former ambassador to Liberia. And then on the bottom, a presidential appointee, some people that worked in Liberia on the ground that did very good work. They're doing Ebola. That's Jolene Mullins on the lower right with her arms behind her. An ambassador from Guinea who still does a lot of work, and then ambassador from Sierra Leone. And the guy in the back right behind me is Brady Deaton. He is a Obama appointee, and he stayed on with the Trump administration, but he is in the Bureau for International Food and Agriculture Development, and he was instrumental in helping us coordinate that food security, health security aspect of that in U.S. Agency for International Development. Huge help. So lots of good people to work with back there. And so we're talking again about that capacity building. So on the left, rabies clinic, we've got this young woman who's really concerned about her dogs and worried about, what's a shot going to do to them and is it going to hurt? So we're so much more alike than we are different. And so I taught them communication skills. So they were using these communication skills to build relationship with this young woman, explain to her what was going on, keep the messaging really, really simple. And ultimately we were able to vaccinate these dogs. As an aside, the fuzzy dog on the left, very unusual. Most of the dogs in Liberia look like the little black and tan one on the right. So that big fuzzy dog that looks like a golden doodle, that was the only one I saw the entire time we were there. And then on the right is Mr. Bromfield Reeves. He's a county supervisor, kind of like our governors in Liberia. And I was working with him for Department of Defense on what they call the West African Disaster Preparedness Initiative, another historic program where they dialed this right down to the community level to help these communities work together and understand what they needed for any type of hazard. So it could be a fire, a flood, a landslide, saltwater incursion into fresh water, windstorms. Mr. Reeves' community dealt with windstorms all the time. And what was beautiful about this is bringing people together from tribes that had historically only ever been in conflict. And some very thoughtful paramount chiefs who said, this is our opportunity to try to bring people together. First time some of these people had ever shared a meal together or worked cooperatively together. It was absolutely magical. So what we do makes a difference on the ground, and it keeps us all safer. So not that I'm all that self-absorbed, but I like that there's so many benefits to doing this work, and what our international aid money does, especially with programs like this. And then this is in Washington, so you can see, we're same thing. We're out in the rain, we're out in the mud, we're on the ground, and this was at the Oso Darrington landslide. And these are collaborative teams made up of medical professionals and first responders and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to put this slide up. This was, I think I have a link for this video as well, Bob. If people are interested in that interface between developing countries, poverty, global health challenges, health system strengthening resilience, this was a panel that I sat on in association with the World Health Assembly. And I would recommend, if people are really interested in this, I would recommend that they take some time, play it in the background while they're doing dishes or working out or something. But you can see here that the people, there's a lot of people across the world and across many different organizations that care about this stuff and are collaborating together to address some of these issues. And this is the panel. Kent Brantley, you probably heard about him, the doctor that worked for Samaritan's Purse that was infected with Ebola and treated, was a guest at the end. And a nurse that worked with him, Kindi Kobai, ended up meeting. So they got Ebola about the same time. The difference is Kent's in the US, she's in Liberia. She died probably of Ebola symptom-related health issues a couple of years ago. Kent had a rough time, but he's doing pretty well now, as I understand it. So even accident of birth, right? Where do we get our health systems? And is it fair to have people, like, do we all care that everybody have an equal access to trying to have good health and enjoy a full and happy life? So now we can get into Central America. So one of the congressman's other deep, deep loves was the Northern Triangle of Central America for all of those three reasons: national, family, and economic security. But he had a real heart for people at the community level. He had traveled down to, I think it was Guatemala. So when I was in office, there was an organization called the Inter-America Foundation. And Bob, I've given that as a link for donations as well. Very, very small government agency, government international development agency. I think their budget, they get appropriated about $15 to $18 million a year. They only directly fund community groups on the ground, in this case in Latin America and the Caribbean. And they vet all the programs, they go and they look at them, they help them, and then when it's done, it's done. And if they have problems, they may offer some advice to walk them through, but it's not this endless cycle of aid. So this is a group of young entrepreneurs in Honduras, and you can't see everything, but they've got eggs, they've got, oh my God, the best artisan cashews I've ever had in my life. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring them back with me, so I ate them all while I was there. They have a bakery, so they want to stay there. So they're always at risk, because the minute they start making a little bit of money, the gangs are after them for the money. So but they want to stay there. They don't want to leave. They want to have some opportunities, some education. They want their communities. Their families have lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So these programs that really don't cost a whole lot on measure, and you can see they look pretty happy, right? They maintain their culture, very hospitable, family and community oriented first, which resonates really well with me. And I think it's why sometimes in the US, people don't really understand just how heart-wrenching it is for people to have to leave these communities, because we tend to be more individualistic first, and they tend to be family and community oriented first. Same with Thailand when I worked there, same with Africa when I worked there, not the same in Europe when I worked there. So my preference is to work in places where community and family come first, because that's kind of my personal orientation. This is a Salvadorian farmers co-op, and they had a model of livestock exchange that was similar to Heifer International. So there was a donor there from the US. They have these, what they call the hometown associations, where people send money back to these communities. So Inter-America Foundation was working with some of the leaders of these hometown organizations in the US to help them be more strategic about how they were spending their money and to help them coordinate. So in these programs with IAF, the community projects have to have skin in the game. They don't just get given money, they have to have skin in the game as well. But the guy that came there, he's always at risk because he goes back and forth between the US and El Salvador. We had to have a security team with us when we were there because the crime is so rampant. Again, how do we keep people in the communities where they want to stay? And you can see some of these people look very Mayan. The Mayan in these communities, the indigenous Indians, are marginated even within Honduran and Salvadorian communities. So they had kind of the double whammy. But a lot of them are the agriculturalists and the artisans, very important for food security. And this is a tiny, tiny bodega, little store in Honduras. I can't remember this young man's name. I've got it in my notes somewhere, but he's running this little store. So it's accomplishing several things, and with some support from IAF. You know, there's no food available. People have to get on buses and pay money to travel, and it can take an entire day to go someplace and get food. And he can have this little concern there. He has friends that left. He missed them horribly, and he's doing everything he can to stay and support his community by running this little store, making some money, and hopefully expanding opportunities for other people so that they can stay in the communities and have some security and provide for their families and get a little education as well. So he was, but again, he's very much at risk, which is why looking at those security pieces of it is so important. All right, that's all I got, Bob.
Oh my gosh, Carrie, my mind is absolutely reeling. So I think one of the reasons I wanted to invite you on is the same reason I'm going to have Reginaldo Hasset Marroquin on the 18th to the 19th of August. Regi was from Guatemala, survived conditions that we couldn't even imagine.
Right.
Just could not even imagine. Is still suffering the results of treatment, by the Army.
Just as an aside, Bob, when we were in the Northern Triangle, we were supposed to go to Guatemala, but it was too unsafe. They wouldn't let us go. We had security teams in Honduras and El Salvador, but they wouldn't let us go to Guatemala because it was so unsafe. So yeah, still going on.
So as we've discussed, any very complex geopolitical situation has a lot of roots, right?
Yes.
As you pointed out, in Liberia, there were tribes that were constantly fighting with each other. That wasn't from the outside, that was from the inside. That said, what I have a hard time understanding why people don't ask more questions about why all the folks are migrating north.
Right.
And specifically, what is the history of the US involvement in the area that may in fact have helped create some of those conditions. We've heard very uplifting things from you about US efforts now to help in those situations. So it is complex, but I think it's really important for us to understand why these circumstances are happening and what, if any, responsibility we as a society have.
Well, so I have a different perspective on that. The history there is very, very complex, and I'll give you some great links for that. But I don't want to place blame at the US's feet all the time, because every developed country in the world has had some colonial background. Everybody's been conquered and colonized. I mean, it's a thing, right? I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's a thing. And we have been involved in nation building and leadership building, and it's happening. And I mean, we see examples of that. Our meddling and the meddling of others in places like you see the crisis that's going on in Venezuela right now. I'm surprised there's not more about that in the news, because that's a pretty scary crisis and part of the work I do with global disaster response, and that's a real problem down in the southern Caribbean now. So, but I think moreover, it's a question of what kind of people do we want to be? You know, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. My older son is really having a hard time knowing that his tax dollars are going to things that are just egregiously awful. You know, wars where innocents are being killed in huge numbers, and that we don't really have a say. I kind of wish we had a setup where we could, like when you make a donation to an organization, you can just give them a general donation to do whatever they want with, or you can do a donation where you say, okay, I want to give money to your rabies campaign in Africa, or your elephant rescue campaign in Thailand, whatever that is. And I wish we could target our tax dollars that way, because I think our voices would have a different level of impact. You were the one that introduced me to Kai from Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and you and I both know that's where the money was for them to do community rights work. It was in the environmental arena, but it doesn't necessarily have to be just that. But their goal is the same thing. What do we do to protect, insulate, build up, make communities resilient wherever they exist? And when we have, by accident of birth alone, been born to great opportunity and great privilege, and there's some of us in the US that haven't been, that are as egregiously poor and fraught as anybody in any developing country, Appalachia, for instance, or horrible, horrible crime for generations now in places like Chicago. These are systemic problems. And frankly, corporate money, I'll just say it, I don't think it's a big surprise to anybody. Corporate money, if you want to find out why these things happen, you follow the money. That's what you do, you follow the money. So I have to know the intricate history for a lot of the work that I do. This cause of the Blood Diamond Wars, the civil wars in West Africa, in Sierra Leone and Liberia, were based on inflated food prices. The cost of rice went way up and people were starving, and it led to these violent conflicts because that was, they were thinking the government had done that. So it really depends. Right now, what they don't talk a lot about, unless you're a nerd like me and dig into the sciencey kind of stuff, a lot of the drivers for migration now, we learned about this when we were down there, are things related to climate change. And I'm not going to get into the debate with people about whether they want to agree that humans have impacted that or not, because it doesn't matter. Read something by a Republican legislator said, it doesn't really matter why. Now we have this problem. What can we do about it? So climate, inability to farm, soil erosion, loss of water, degradation of the land is driving a lot of the migration, because a lot of these rural communities in Central America and other places depend on agriculture. And there's no, we're having problems with urbanization. If you look up urbanization and what that's looking like, where people are leaving the rural areas, we're losing ag producers, they're moving to the cities. There's no infrastructure, there's no capacity to handle them all there. We've got conflict and infectious diseases and more and more nutrition security, because the type of foods that's available to people is not nutritious. It's prepared fast food. We see that here in the US as well. So why, there's many, many reasons why it happens. I think when we were there, one of the guys that ran a bakery where he was training kids to be bakers had been attacked, beaten up, all of his equipment stolen, like more than once or twice, and yet he comes back again. And they're not leaving because they want to. They're leaving because they just, it's that or get killed or die of starvation. So it's one hope that they have. And the other thing is, no one talks about it. I'm kind of confused. Migrants from Central America go to many, many other countries than the US. I've got the list somewhere. Some of that was in my congressional notes and I wasn't able to take it with me, but we're not the only country that's absorbing migrants. And if you look at what's coming out of Syria and things that are happening with Yemen, if you look at, Jordan, for instance, is a country that's absorbed many, many migrants. I think I read, or in my global health security class, I think the average length of time that people are spending once they're in a displacement camp and a refugee camp, guess the number of years, 17 years.
Wow.
So we've got engineers and doctors and teachers and young, bright, creative people that are stuck in these camps. And how are we mining that? How are we plumbing that human capacity to make the world a better place? So unfortunately, a lot of the focus now is how are we building things around refugee camps? And it's, again, these are not sustainable models, but highest number of displaced people in the world now than we've ever seen from violent conflict and climate refugees are the two greatest contributors to that. So I think certainly in the US, if you look at the climate change piece alone and you believe any of the really hard science, it's not really controvertible at this point, the developed countries contribute far more to climate change and the developing countries contribute much less, but they're more significantly impacted for a whole variety of reasons. And a lot of that is not just that they're poor, it's where they're located in the world and how those climate changes are impacting them. So one of the reasons I want to work so hard on West Africa is they have a really, really important rainforest there. And if that rainforest collapses, it can have a domino effect with other rainforests around the world and temperate forests. So trying to maintain trying to be good environmental stewards and maintain that biodiversity and that habitat is critically important just for being able to clean the air. I think air pollution is the biggest cause of death now worldwide. And again, it's going to be developing countries where they don't have air conditioning and they go through a dry season where there's a lot of dust and it's kicking up all of these nasty particles. What can we do? And my argument is, from the standpoint of the work I do, we have to talk to the communities and the local folks, find out what it is that they need and how do we partner, not mandate to, but partner with them to understand this stuff. And this problem, it was really bad right before I got to Congress, the migration issue, and no one's found the answer yet. It's a vexing problem. My preference would be for them to get some complex systems engineers involved in looking at that, and they can do that. They've got enough data. But most people in government seem to be reticent to do that because they can pinpoint where are the most likely areas that we could have an impact with the resources that we have. So it's great to say we want to do all this stuff, but if we don't have all of the time and money and people and hard resources we need to do it, then it doesn't make any sense. So that's why you engage complex systems, especially somebody like Eva Lee at Georgia Tech, who can also model human behavior. And the work that she does is absolutely fascinating. So if I were running the world, she would be my right-hand tech person and I would take her with me everywhere and she would work that all out. That probably wasn't a very helpful answer, but.
Super helpful answer, because I think what I was driving at, to a very substantial degree, what is past is past.
Right.
In our personal lives, in our national lives. On the other hand, if in our own lives we have no cognition of how we got where we are, what are the behaviors that gave us good results? What are the behaviors that gave us not good results? If we don't have some kind of inner capacity to introspect and to understand how we end up where we end up. So one of the things that I'm trying to achieve by many of these conversations with Life with Bob is to have people understand a little bit more about what's underneath what's going on. Because if we're simply context bound within what's going on, then we may, first of all, we may not take responsibility, adequate responsibility as a society for our part in creating the situation. And even if that wasn't the case, simple compassion requires us to do that. And if that isn't enough, we're all in this together. What happens in Central America, what happens in Africa, what happens all over the world impacts us in a very direct way, economically, environmentally, and everything else. So even if a person says, hey, I want to take care of my home first, taking care of my home really involves doing a lot of this work. And what I'd love to have you talk about, Carrie, is this vast cadre of people in the government.
Right.
Again, it's kind of de rigueur to say, well, the government is this and that. My observation is there's a vast cadre of incredibly dedicated people, both elected and the folks like you were talking about, the scientists and the doctors coming in and helping to advise the government. Talk to us a little about what you saw there and what was very hopeful and uplifting and powerful about that whole system that we have in our government.
Sure. So I want to make one quick observation. I just heard a professor from Washington University who looks at income disparities speak, and people brought up, what's the difference between us and, say, Sweden or whatever. And he was talking about some kind of behavioral stuff, and when he said this, a lot of understanding crystallized for me. I grew up in Southern California, very ethnically diverse area. Parents, we just grew up that way. So, but what he said was, in places like Sweden, these social systems that are in place so that everybody's supported and gets family leave or, equitable pay or whatever, people look the same, right? Almost everybody is blonde-haired and blue-eyed, to be a little stereotypical, but people look the same. And we know, and there's probably, we know that there are adaptive ways that people look at different. So if you're a caveman, something different shows up, it's scary, you don't know what it is. There's reason that people get sort of a knee-jerk response to things, people, places that are different until they get to know more about them and learn them and feel safe around them, or make a judgment that, no, that's not safe, I don't want to be around that. So one of the problems that we seem to have in the US is it's such a melting pot that the people that are in positions of power are largely older white males. No offense to you, because you're like you are, but
who are you calling an older white male?
I didn't say elderly. I just said older, right? Hey, anybody that can do a two-handed, like up in the air plank thing, I'm not going to argue that. So we should all be so lucky. So what I see, especially doing the social and behavioral science work around trauma and having worked in traumatized communities in Africa, traumatized communities in Central America, in Thailand, in the US, and then all around the world on these Department of Defense projects, guess what? Our basic human needs are the same and our fears are the same. And so our approach is to, if we, and the other thing we forget is, guess what? The US isn't going to be feeding the US very many years down the line. Look at all of the produce that we have imported into the country right now.
Massive.
So we want these countries to know about food safety and biosecurity, and we want them to know about regeneration of soil and organic farming, because we're going to get our food sourced from Africa. I think the Africa Union just came up with a common African currency. So they're trying to stabilize their own currency and really build themselves up as being self-sufficient. A lot of our policies in the past are just what I explained before. We go drop off a bunch of money, we drop off a bunch of aid. Most of it goes to administration in the NGOs, and we're wiping out the local economies and the local capacity to do it. Perfect example. If you're the mosquito net maker in X country and somebody does a rock concert and they raise a bunch of money to get mosquito nets sent in. So you send the mosquito nets in, the guy that makes them locally, and he's maybe supporting 15 families, and each family's got 10 plus people, they're wiped out. And then in whatever number of years, 5 years, when your nets are falling apart, or the permethrin soap things are floating, people are using this fishing nets, don't start me. Guess what? Now and now we're on to the next shiny world need. It's not mosquito nets anymore, it's something else. There's no capacity left in that country to make replacement mosquito nets. So it's why the efforts, if they're going to be successful, they're focused locally in the communities. It's kind of like, what do we need to be healthy and happy? We need water, we need food, we need housing, shelter, we need healthcare that's accessible and affordable, and we trust it and it's good. You know, those, what they call kind of mission critical functions, those attributes people need to be healthy and secure and prosperous. Everybody needs those, and this whole world is connected. So this idea that we can keep people marginalized and you know, in conflict and not having the resources that they need to learn how to steward the environment, the concept that we're not going to be impacted by that is just ludicrous. And I think the thing that's a little frightening to me is that, I mean, I work with a bunch of scientists, so, you know, I every once in a while make a mistake and believe something that's not true. And then usually I've got a science friend that goes, hey, that person died 5 years ago and that article's 4 years old and there's new data now. Okay. But, you know, I live in an area of facts. And I think the thing that's astonishing me the most is how much fear is driving the negative sentiment about what's happening with the migrants. And I kind of don't care, you know, once they get here, if they're coming into our country, hopefully as asylum seekers, we have a process in place for that. We've got the Geneva Conventions. You know, what kind of people do we want to be? To me, that's the bottom line. What kind of people do we want to label people as monsters and animals and somehow subhuman? Which, I'm sorry, is a very, I'm just going to say this, very entitled way of looking at things. The Republicans I worked with in Congress, so it's kind of funny because they all have their Democratic buddies. So it could be elephant trafficking and poaching in Africa, or it could be food security, or it could be the global health stuff. We were always collaborating. And so what you have is this higher level of leadership that are the party leaders, the Speaker of the House. You know, they're the ones that are sort of the mouthpieces, and that's where the partisan stuff comes in. But the people like Congressman Fortenberry and my local rep, Derek Kilmer, they were on the same appropriations committee together, both huge proponents of global health and poverty alleviation, work down the hall from one another. Some of their ideas are different, but a lot of them are really, really similar, like down to organics and small family farms and stuff. So, you know, it was pretty seamless how folks work together. And the other thing I think people don't understand is that there's a lot of informal, you know, part of the consulting I do is how do we look at innovative policy approaches to developing new legislative remedies, new policy remedies for doing some of these things. So if you've got a food security policy in place, how do you know it's working? Because they don't give any money in these grants for people to go out 5 or 10 years and see if what they were doing was working. So how do you collaborate to help people say, well, part of the policy is we got to figure out, is our policy supporting the kind of work we want to do in a changed world? And I have a new resource to send you that I will about democratizing Congress and getting knowledge to Congress.
Yes, I saw that, and we'll.
Yeah, and Lorelei, oh my God, Lorelei would be wonderful to have on for a talk.
Well, so, yeah, and you can refer people to, and I was first thinking, okay, I got 52 weeks a year.
Yeah, okay. Right.
And then now I'm thinking, gosh, I only have 52 weeks in a year.
I know, right?
It's like way more people. So I think what you said is really, really important, because I think most of us tend to, in the political arena, one kind of worldview or another worldview. And what you talked about was kind of an interesting nexus that, you know, one worldview is we got to help people. And so we go and we give them fish, or we even try to help them understand how to fish. But as Mark Weiss, who's going to be on next week, said, he's head of global urban development. He said, you folks have absolutely no idea how all those people in the favelas, and in places where you couldn't even survive, man, do they know how to fish.
Absolutely.
They can teach you how to fish.
And sustainably. Yep.
They don't have access to the resources. So the coming together of the left and the right, the coming together to not decide that the elephant's a wall. No, it's a tree. No, it's a rope. It's a fan. It kind of depends, the blind man, blind people touching the elephant, kind of depends on what part of the elephant you're near. What I really truly believe is needed, and my own brother, David, was the head of science and technology at USAID, and really understood that you can't come in and dictate policy. It has to come from the place where the policy is going to be,
absolutely,
actually going to be implemented. So we could really talk on, but I think this really calls us, anyone who's on the program here or listens to it later on, calls us to be really thoughtful about A, our own positions, our own biases, and B, really look at where is the great work being done. And I think having experts like you on and having curated resources, so if someone wants to really understand not only what the genesis of the problem is, because oftentimes that's quite important, particularly in terms of what we should be doing. What are the solutions? Where are the solutions? How do solutions, not just isolated solutions, but how do systems inform us?
The other thing I'd like to mention too, and I've done a couple of them, but Harvard has various implicit bias tests that people can do. So I'll send you the link for that.
Oh yes, please.
As much as I try to be aware and not, the tests are very interesting, and I'm dealing with it all the time. I don't like have it pointed out to me that I have biases, but everybody has them. And if I could pick just one thing for people to do right now, it would be to do some of those tests. They've got ones on race and a whole group of them. But to really understand what might be informing, and then the other thing I would say is that there are many legislators out there. They're doing this because they feel a deep moral imperative to serve and to make the world and their communities a better place. And a lot of the work that they're doing is informal, behind the lines, under the radar screen, with another political figure that they meet at an international meeting who also cares about, I don't know, nuclear disarmament. And so they, through relationship building and talking and thinking and trying to be innovative and creative, they can come up with ideas and massage that behind the scenes and then bring it to the forefront. So there's so much work going on that's so very, very important that people are never going to see because it's confidential and it's quiet and it's behind the scenes and it's often between parties that probably publicly couldn't be shown to be working together. It's pretty exciting. It was really exciting. I got a better understanding of why things were so messed up when I got back there, but it was also heartening to see what can be done if the people in the highest positions of power don't keep driving everything that they want through fear. And I think that's the biggest problem, is people are they've gotten fearful, and the next iteration of that is, I think, a lot of this anger that we're seeing and this divisiveness. And I have to watch myself. It's pretty easy to go, what are you thinking? And that doesn't get us in there. So, yeah.
Well, Carrie, thank you.
Oh, really, my pleasure.
I mean, I'm sitting here going, okay, my biases are showing, like my friend Lou Tice said, we're talking about scotomas, blind spots. He says,
That's right.
I always knew you had blind spots.
Yeah.
I just didn't know I had them.
That's right. So, and I dose myself on those implicit bias tests. I'm not going to do more than one of those a week, probably, because I come out pretty disappointed with myself. Yeah. So I will get that list of resources for you, and I think you said you wanted the slides, so I'll get those to you as well.
Yeah, that's great. So, Carrie, thank you very much. Before we stop our live stream, I just want to thank you for spending this really illuminating hour. I knew this was going to be good, but it really burst through any expectations I had. It was just fabulous. We'll have you on again. This is an ongoing conversation, and we'll invent some things to come from this, where then we might create a study group of people who are particularly interested in an area of your expertise, and we just get together and we study it together. I mean, this is the kind of civic engagement, knowledgeable civic engagement that can get us beyond the political noise, because we really must get beyond the political noise. Even though I have to admit, I am a political noisemaker. That's so.
We're all in the, hopefully people dig down and they're good-hearted and with a little collaboration and understanding. I think I guess what I would like to tell people is, the things that we're being told to be fearful of are not really the things that, like as a scientist, I think about being fearful of. So we could talk about the opioid epidemic in one point. That would be it, or the institutionalization of prisons. That could be another fun topic to discuss as far as what that does for public health and preparedness. And
I could just have you be the permanent Life with Bob speaker. And we would probably not run out of things to talk about in 52 weeks. So Carrie, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Bob. See you again next time.